This video is brought to you by Magic Spoon. Hey Wisecrack, Michael here. We're brought here today because of the most hyped release of 2020, Cyberpunk 2077. Wrong thing. The other hyped release, the vaccines for COVID-19. And with the miracles of modern science comes people screaming that inoculation against a deadly disease is fascist. Now, there's too much being said and done by anti-vaxxers to cover in one video. And maybe that stuff is the topic for another video, or two, or a feature-length documentary. But today, I want to focus on the history of anti-vaxxers, especially in America, to try to figure out just where it all came from. Because people being furious about vaccines is no historical oddity. It's not enough to just reduce it to people are dumb. Instead, we can learn a lot about our own flawed healthcare system.
Healthcare workers began lining up to get the vaccine. First come, first serve. And turns out there wasn't even enough vaccine for everybody who made it here.
And our national love of grifters by trying to answer the question, anti-vaxxers, what went wrong? And before we get into it, I want to give a shout out to this week's sponsor, Magic Spoon. Breakfast is one of the best and most important meals of the day. There are so many options, and who doesn't love a bowl of cereal? I love it until halfway through the day when I crash from my sugar high. So many store-bought cereals are just pure sugar and are filled with junk. They don't really help you feel energized or fueled for the day. That's just one reason why Magic Spoon is great. It's keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, low-carb, GMO-free, and most importantly, delicious. Last time I talked about the 4 original flavors, cocoa, fruity, frosted, and blueberry. But now you can get their 2 new flavors, peanut butter and cinnamon. If you really want to start off your year with some healthier choices, then I definitely recommend trying it out for yourself. Click the link in the description to get some Magic Spoon cereal today. You can get $5 off your Build Your Own Variety box by using code Wisecrack at checkout. Choose the flavors you want to try and check it out. Magic Spoon is so confident in their cereal, they've backed it with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it, they'll refund you. No questions asked. Click the link in the description and use code Wisecrack at checkout for $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/wisecrack. Now, back to the show. Part 1, the rise of vaccines. Before we can understand the modern day backlash against vaccines, we need to look at how they became widely popular in America in the first place. The basic premise behind vaccination, that you can become immune from a disease by exposing yourself to a pathogen, goes back at least 1,000 years to China. There, the dried scabs of smallpox victims would be ground up and blown into the noses of children. You know what they say, if you've ever done a line of coke off a toilet seat in a public bathroom, don't worry about what's in the smallpox nose powder. The technique spread and was tweaked as hundreds of years later, the Ottomans decided to jab people under the skin rather than giving them a little nose candy. This technique, or at least a similar one of a different origin, made its way to America when an enslaved African named Onesimus was gifted to one Cotton Mather, the Salem witch trial guy. Onesimus taught Mather how to immunize people against smallpox, what's called variolation, and Mather spoke to other enslaved Africans who had undergone the process and knew it worked. Later, doctors like John Fuster figured out that exposure to smallpox's less crappy bovine cousin, cowpox, would grant immunity against the nastier disease. Edward Jenner would go on to inoculate people with said cowpox, calling his procedure vaccination, from the Latin word vacca, cow. As soon as the smallpox inoculation became a thing, it started changing history. Around the time this Jenner business was happening, Americans would lose the invasion of Quebec after a smallpox outbreak decimated American troops and not their immunized foes. Napoleon, understanding the strategic benefit of vaccination, mandated the procedure for his troops. And Thomas Jefferson, ever the curious mind, did medical experiments on his slaves to see if the vaccination would work. Yikes. Of course, once people like Mather and Jenner started advocating for vaccines and variolations, people started getting very, very mad at them. When Mather started spreading the gospel of variolation in America, his compatriots accused him of spreading smallpox with the procedure. Someone even threw a grenade into his bedroom window that didn't explode. It had a note reading, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you. I'll inoculate you with this, with a pox to you." In Jenner's England, critics responded to his cowpox-derived vaccine with comics like this. featuring people sprouting mini cows from their butt cheeks and mouth holes. Later, there were also anti-vaccine riots in places like Virginia in the 1760s. It's easy to dismiss this response as superstition or sheer stupidity, and in some cases, superstition and ignorance do play a huge role, but there's more to it. Instead, we have to understand the tangled web of mistrust and greed that breeds resistance to vaccines. And a big chunk of that resistance today and hundreds of years ago was spawned by a distrust of the government, sometimes justified and sometimes not. Take Napoleon Bonaparte, who mandated vaccination among troops for strategic purposes. He admired Edward Jenner. He went on to say, Jenner, I can refuse him nothing. But after Napoleon's fall, the French became wary of everything that smacked of his dictatorship. That included the smallpox vaccine, a distrust that would contribute to their loss in the Franco-Prussian War half a century later. In England, according to vaccine historian Stuart Bloom, mandatory vaccine laws were a minor inconvenience to those who could afford their own medical care. Everyone else was instructed to be vaccinated for free. But the whole operation was run by the deeply hated poor law guardians. The resentment came from working class people about the growing disciplining of the body exerted by the British state. The Netherlands also saw an anti-vaccine backlash. But importantly, Bloom notes, in Europe it was often a resistance to compulsion, not the vaccines themselves. That is, people are more pissed about being told what to do. Later in America, not surprisingly, popular support for vaccines boomed at a time when trust for government was at an all-time high during World War II. As historian Elena Konis writes, news reports boasted that thanks to vaccines, American troops were safe from tetanus, pneumonia, yellow fever, and other infectious diseases. Considering that many wars saw death from infectious disease outnumber actual combat deaths, this was no minor accomplishment. As Konis writes, vaccines were woven into the narrative Americans told about how scientific and technological prowess had made the United States the leader of the free world. Back home, citizens were happy to do their part to maintain a war-ready populace by getting their immunizations. In 1943, one poll found 90% of people trusted in vaccines. When a smallpox outbreak occurred in New York City 4 years later, over 6 million people lined up to be voluntarily vaccinated. Over the next few decades, America would go ape for vaccines. And to be fair, most people today are still pretty jazzed about not getting polio. We obviously still live in a world where vaccine acceptance is the norm, which brings us to today, and how our modern medical system helped birth the anti-vaxxer movement. Part 2, the rise of the modern anti-vaxxer. In the 1960s, a new narrative emerged that would define vaccine criticism for decades to come. Before we get into that, a note about terms. I use the term anti-vaxxer to describe a group of activists that others might call vaccine critics. There are a lot of reasons people don't vaccinate their children, from the medically recognized kind in consultation with doctors, to vaccine hesitancy, sometimes as a result of anti-vax propaganda, to the new vaccines are bad crowd, to the full-blown all vaccines are bad crowd. When I say anti-vaxxer, I mean people involved with and engaged in spreading anti-vaccine pseudoscience. People like Jim Carrey and Jenny McCarthy are anti-vaxxers, not because they hate all vaccines, including polio.
Well, what are you against? Don't vaccinate for this, but vaccinate for that?
Yes.
But because they're part of a network of activists that spreads vaccine misinformation. Much of this movement sucks because of a simple fact. Doctors, historically, kinda suck. The medical profession, which for much of history was run by exclusively male doctors, was often dismissive of female patients' complaints and didn't feel the need to treat them as humans capable of having a say in their own healthcare decisions. What's more, women's very real medical problems were frequently attributed to that blanket word, hysteria, slang for, your uterus is making you crazy. In the 1960s, feminist activists raised awareness about the dangers of drugs commonly prescribed to women, like oral contraception. Dangers that were often never communicated by the doctors prescribing them or the pharmaceutical companies manufacturing them. A congressional hearing over the safety of the pill led to one expert saying, estrogen is to cancer what fertilizer is to wheat, prompting women to angrily ask, why are you using women as guinea pigs? One of the responses to this whole doctors don't take us seriously and routinely don't give us enough information to make our own decisions was to recenter medical expertise within women themselves. A sentiment expressed in phrases like, mother knows best. This divide is evident, for instance, in the documentary DPT, Vaccine Roulette, a catalyst for much of the modern anti-vaccine movement. While the documentary features scientists and experts explaining the safety of the pertussis vaccine, it juxtaposes them with mothers and their disabled children, as if to make the central conflict doctors and the women they don't take seriously. It's a recurring motif to this day.
The days of paternalism in medical policy are over. People are taking control of their own health.
The uncomfortable relationship between predominantly male doctors and their female patients is also clear when, for instance, Jenny McCarthy invokes the concept of refrigerator moms, a since discredited medical theory that blames emotionally unavailable mothers for their child's autism.
We were known as refrigerator mothers, cold and uncaring to our children. Well, take a look around. I believe science was wrong yet again.
Similar themes come up in the Black community, where vaccine hesitancy can run high. When asked, those hesitancies are often grounded in a cultural distrust of the government or influenced by the dark history of medical experimentation on the Black community, including but not limited to the Tuskegee syphilis experiments or just old Tommy Jefferson testing his smallpox vaccine on 200 people, 80 of which were his slaves. While the source of the distrust may often be well-founded, the response sometimes isn't. When talking about doctors giving poor treatment to women, the pseudoscience it inspires often fails to understand the ongoing struggle of people within the medical community to make it better. As in, real doctors and nurses with actual medical training and activists who aren't trying to get you to do a juice cleanse. The movement against doctor paternalism has stressed patient autonomy and joint decision-making, the kind of thing where a doctor might lay out the various options you have and help you make your own decisions. In the meantime, people have been radicalized away from science-based medicine towards homeopaths and people hawking dangerous bleach cures. Proponents will offer the common refrain that, at least in contrast to doctors, these people make their patients feel heard. I think then it's not enough to mock people who turn to homeopaths.
Get me some wolfsbane, also known as monkshood, in here, and a whole tray of flower remedies.
But look long and hard about why they turn there in the first place. And the answer is clear. Our medical systems need a lot of work. And just like dictators make people distrust all kinds of governments, bad doctors make people distrust all kinds of medical practices. This is not the only case of real concerns over a real thing having led people to fortify themselves into even worse ideas. You might have heard that vaccine manufacturers are lying to us for money. And, well, I think the story of how private companies killed public vaccines is kind of relevant. Part 3. Money. At the turn of the 20th century, America was being transformed from a place where bloodletting still happened into a powerhouse of medical research that rivaled its European peers. That, of course, included researching and making vaccines. And a lot of that was being done outside of private companies. In 1895, for instance, the New York Department of Health was producing and distributing an antitoxin for diphtheria, a method learned from European scientists. That was then spread freely to other health departments and private companies in the US. But all this government's doing vaccines thing wasn't good business for the nascent pharmaceutical industry. So they set out to undermine the public part of public health. They would criticize municipal facilities for being inadequate, which may or may not have been true because they also poached their best scientists with lucrative salaries. They'd also say the government was undercutting the commercial market, which is funny because it was publicly funded research that generally got them into the vaccine business to begin with. This didn't kill public health, at least right away. As late as the 1950s and 60s, the spirit of scientific cooperation survived. As Bloom writes, the flows of virus strains or know-how were scarcely hindered by commercial interest. But the "you can't trust the shoddy vaccine work of the government" narrative would really start paying off in the 1980s. As Bloom writes, free market advocates would cast doubt on public sector vaccine producers by suggesting they were made in outdated facilities or lacked independent regulation. By 1996, the state of Michigan owned the only public vaccine producer when it was put up for sale. It was the country's only licensed producer of an anthrax vaccine, which didn't interest private buyers until fears of bioterrorism fueled commercial interest in 1998. It was also in the 80s, with the passing of the Bayh-Dole Act, the vaccines turned from a good for humanity into intellectual property, Bloom argues. Politicians favored market solutions and stripped public health institutions of funding, and as a result, the ability to deal with urgent public health issues, like a future pandemic.
The head of the CDC has said recently that it's been chronically underfunded for years by different administrations.
The lack of public health infrastructure is why, for instance, a huge part of vaccine distribution in the US will rely on private companies like Walgreens and CVS. It also can help us understand why the US seems to be chronically behind on vaccinations, since most public infrastructure that could even store or distribute the vaccine has long since disappeared. Now, I don't think that if public health departments were cranking out a COVID vaccine, that anti-vaxxers would simply go away. As scholar Anna Kirkland notes, a substantial part of the anti-vaccine movements also opposes public health measures that would empower the government. However, anti-vax propaganda about greedy companies seems a lot more plausible when people are aware of the very real cases of deceit in the industry. Deceit like when GlaxoSmithKline paid the largest fine ever for fraudulent marketing and withholding safety data about a diabetes drug, or when the Sacklers and Purdue Pharmacy helped create the opioid epidemic. And look, nobody loves shitting on Big Pharma more than I do. But at the same time, it's important to remember, there exists a mind-boggling amount of regulations on the industry exactly because we know it's full of profit-hungry people with a pretty weak moral compass. Pharmaceutical companies have to prove their vaccines are safe and effective, and those claims are rigorously vetted by the last vestiges of our public health infrastructure. But you know who doesn't have to be rigorously vetted? Your friendly neighborhood supplement hawker, who has all the same claims of curing you with none of that actually provable scrutiny.
The Genesis 2 Church of Health and Healing is promoting this product called Master Mineral Solution as a cure-all remedy, but the FDA warns it's like drinking bleach.
Yikes.
More extreme snake oil aside, the very profitable supplement industry in general has strongly resisted and rigorously lobbied against any proposed regulations, presumably for fear that they'd have to prove anything they sell, actually works. This situation is nothing new, in America at least. Bloom writes that American opposition to vaccines in the 1800s, unlike its European peers, was largely led by irregular physicians who were well aware that vaccines threatened their snake oil practice. Which brings us to part 4. Also money, but worse. It's impossible to understand anti-vaxxerism without understanding that large swaths of its leadership are grifters. That doesn't mean every misled parent or everyone who has shared a dumb meme. I mean people like Andrew Wakefield, author of the discredited study linking the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine to autism. It turns out Wakefield was commissioned to do so by a legal firm trying to get a fat paycheck from a medical malpractice lawsuit. The children from his study were directly fed to him from the lawyers representing their families.
And it turned out that some of the kids in his small study had been referred by a lawyer who was suing pharmaceutical manufacturers on the children's behalf.
A scientist in Wakefield's lab even demanded his name be taken off the studies after Wakefield included what were clearly false positives of measles into the final paper. He also spread alarmism about the vaccine while he was working on his own MMR vaccine, which would have become massively profitable if he could scare enough people into taking it. Today, despite losing his medical license, Wakefield is a celebrity among anti-vax circles, working on documentaries and regularly appearing at conferences. Wakefield wasn't the first or last example where pure financial interest drove vaccine criticism. Remember our irregular physicians in the 1800s? Another instructive example comes from a periodical called Truth Teller. As scholar Michael Kinch writes, it became an anti-vax powerhouse in the early 20th century. It published the work of Laura Cornelia Little, who claimed that the artificial pollution of the smallpox vaccine killed her child. Ironically, Truth Teller, which regularly advertised homeopathy, opposed the Pure Food and Drug laws drafted in 1906 in response to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. This act led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, the primary instrument in which the government is able to hold pharmaceutical companies accountable today. So why would homeopaths campaign against a call for pure food and also regulated drug safety? Because the laws also put people selling bullshit homeopathic cures out of business. As Kinch writes, the very real suffering and animus felt by the followers of Laura Little were exploited by the Truth Teller and Laura Little herself, who sold a series of additional publications on the perils of vaccines to a gullible public. Today, of course, is no different, as anti-vax propaganda puts forward images of suffering children to scare people into the office of their nearest homeopath. It is no coincidence that almost every vaccine skeptic you see has their own cures. From Thomas, maybe viruses aren't real, Cowan, who sells $50 beet powder, to Alex Jones selling COVID cures before getting a cease and desist from the FDA, to whatever the hell Goop is doing. There's also the National Vaccine Information Center, an ironically prominent source of vaccine misinformation, which received roughly 40% of its operating expenses from a single guy named Joseph Mercola, who made bank selling vitamin supplements as an alternative to vaccines. The point is, if people can't differentiate between the grift of pharmaceutical companies price gouging insulin and evidence-based treatment for diabetes and the grift of people pushing bogus COVID cures, it's not just science illiteracy to blame. It's a long history of doctors being bad at their job, medicine for profit, and other grifters casting doubt on established institutions for their own financial benefit. But there is still one more piece of the puzzle I want to talk about today. Part 5, choice. Ultimately, vaccines only work if millions of individuals make the personal decision to get them. And we can't talk about that personal decision without talking about something called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an ideology that stresses that any problems can and should be solved by a free market rather than the government. But also, on a personal level, it frames personal economic decision-making as the ultimate locus of freedom. Neoliberalism is the process in which a person celebrates their personal freedom as they get to pick which vial of $300 insulin they want. Which is not to say personal choice is bad. But as bioethicist Jill Fisher writes, the focus on individual choice serves to obscure the ways in which healthcare inequalities are generated by the system itself. In other words, medical neoliberalism leads to a prioritization of choice over equity and access. In the context of vaccines, neoliberalism frames vaccines as a personal choice rather than, say, a civic duty to not kill people.
And I don't think it's your responsibility to take a vaccine because I might be at the same party with you and you might cough on her.
Compare that rhetoric, say, to the star-studded campaign to find a polio cure.
You know, every child has a right to that, health and happiness.
Which stressed that everyone chip in for a disease that could strike any child.
Send your dimes and dollars to your local March of Dimes headquarters. Help make this the Victory March of Dimes.
When anti-vaxxers and the vaccine hesitant talk about the exceedingly rare complications from vaccines, it's always framed as a direct risk to their child. This is done while ignoring how vaccines are a kind of social contract benefiting everyone. Yes, a person can skip a measles vaccine and not worry too much about getting measles from their vaccinated peers, and this might be an economically rational decision in the same way that cutting in line works great if you're the only one doing it, which you're not.
Once declared eradicated in the United States, measles outbreaks are rattling regions of the country again this year.
But it's not just that this mindset hinders our ability to think about how our actions might affect our friends or community. It also creates a narrative where doing the civic-minded thing is lazy and bad. Anna Kirkland describes a general anxiety around mothers, especially affluent mothers, to do everything in their personal power to make sure their kids are eating right, avoiding carcinogens and other toxins, and overall just being healthy. Anything less is being a bad and lazy mother. It's this mentality which can seduce people. Doing the normal thing is easy and therefore not enough. Finding a bunch of misinformation on Google and buying your kid weird supplements is active and good. Vaccines, Kirkland notes, are for everyone, and they work on the children of both supermoms and slacker moms. The fact that vaccines create an immune response in nearly everyone means that they cannot constitute individual health achievement through doing the right things. Author Seth Mnookin calls some of the anti-vaxxer logic medical NIMBYism, a reference to the maligned not in my backyard kind of social activism that says, I don't want a garbage dump in my backyard. Of course, that's said with the tacit understanding that they very much don't care when it ends up in someone else's. We might think about how affluent parents with secure jobs can take a week off work to care for an ailing child. But that ailing child can infect the children of poorer parents, who, for example, might have to take an unpaid week off work and even end up in medical debt. Or in some contexts, free riding off the herd immunity of others while foregoing the extremely rare risk that vaccines pose.
I would probably advise against it if the rest of the community were getting the pertussis.
So much of anti-vax concern trolling juxtaposes the extremely small chance a child in America will die from things like measles or pertussis. But this glibly ignores the reality. Almost no American children die of pertussis, exactly because most Americans get vaccinated against it.
There's no more polio in the United States, and there's no more diphtheria in the United States, and no child has contracted wild polio since 1979.
As Mnookin notes, the notion that people should base medical decisions on what is right for them is particularly problematic in a public health context, where individual choices cannot be cordoned off from each other. This is not to deny the importance of things like patient autonomy, but unfortunately, anti-vaxxers have stretched the concept to only its most selfish meaning. Ironically, a more reasonable group of people who don't like to get vaccinated can be found in the community-oriented Amish. After a polio outbreak spread in Amish communities in 1979, they reversed course and vaccinated their kids, correctly realizing that they posed a risk to people outside of their own community. The same mentality of seeing individual public health choices as only affecting the one decision maker also rears its head in the anti-mask movement. Not surprisingly, it's a movement spurred on by prominent names in the anti-vaccine movement. And of course, this all gets wrapped up with a general distrust of the government, which, again, does all kinds of other terrible things on a regular basis. As we plow headfirst into 2021, it will be interesting to see if the anti-vaxxer movement thwarts our attempts at herd immunity, or if we'll all get to make out with strangers at the Vanilla Ice concert. But either way, we should look out for how even the worst reactions to problems can still point to real problems, and how we can fix them. Does our medical system need work? Yes. Have we done some awful things in the past? Hell yes. Does this mean I should trust an MLM for all my healthcare needs? No. Dear God, no. But what do you think? Is roasting Jenny McCarthy a public health service, or does it miss the point entirely? Let us know what you think in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for all your support. Annihilate that subscribe button like you're a 97% effective vaccine stamping out the hopefully worst pandemic of our lifetime, and ring that bell like it's closing time at a bar full of inoculated drunkards. And as always, thanks for watching. Later.